So I recently had a debate with Seth Garrett on the topic of if atheism or theism better account for reality. And to be honest, it was an excellent debate. Seth is a smart guy and a formidable opponent. And since that debate, Seth and others have made a couple of follow-up videos. Now, in any debate, simply because of the time limits, there are points that you don't really get to fully address during the debate. So I understand why Seth wanted to make follow-up videos. I also figured a post-debate follow-up might be helpful, just in case there were points Seth made that I did not fully address. So in this video, I'm going to focus on the strongest 3 points raised by Seth either during or after the debate. Plus, I will have a bonus point to address at the end of the video. So these were what I believe were Seth's strongest points. The first is that evolution, which is chance plus selection, explains fine-tuning. The next is the historical failure of God of the gaps thinking often found in religion. And the third is that the universe wasn't made to fit us, but rather the universe made us to fit it. So let's look at number 1. In the debate, my first premise was that anything that comes into existence is either the product of random chance or design. This was the critical point of my argument. It's a dichotomy, but is it a false dichotomy? Are those really the only two options? All someone has to do in order to refute this premise is to provide a third option, something that is not ultimately, and I stress ultimately, the product of chance or design. Seth felt that evolution was that third option.
Since Jacob made such a point to repeat over and over again that it cannot be anything else, there is no third option, I would like to give you a chance to, in as long as you want, just say what you think the third option is, or just what your general response to premise 1 is.
I guess we can just look at this slide. Do you see how in highlight, I've altered the premises to include evolutionary pressures?
Yes. Anything that comes into existence is either the product of random chance, design, evolutionary pressure, or necessity.
Right. And so Jacob, he just, like, without any good argument, he just writes off everything except design, because that's what his goal is.
Actually, I used chance and design as the only two options because they are indeed the only two options. Let me explain. First, I will address evolution.
We have evolution. Evolution is a series of processes, and those processes finely tune things, right?
So remember, evolution is a process, but are processes the product of random chance or design?
Now, I want to re-emphasize this evolutionary principle, because I feel like a lot of theists get this wrong. The mutations are random, but the selection is not random.
This is interesting, because if selection is not the product of random chance ultimately, then what is it the product of?
The process of selecting over time, that's what creates the illusion of design, because all of these random mutations are being molded into something specific for the environment.
Theoretically, even if this were the case, it would not answer the question. Why do we have forces in nature that mold things to fit a particular environment instead of having forces in nature that simply produce random disorder? Evolution is not a third alternative, because the evolutionary processes themselves would have to either be the product of chance or design. Now, there is one other possibility that Seth lists, and that is that things may arise due to necessity.
Back to the argument about necessity versus randomness. I don't find the disagreement with necessity very persuasive, but I don't exactly go that direction with my perspective of reality. But just an example to kind of make you think about this necessity thing. If you had a deck of playing cards and you're playing poker with it or whatever, if every single card in that deck was the same card, every time you draw a card, by necessity, you're getting the same thing.
This is an interesting analogy. If all the cards were aces in the deck, he might just say that they just happen to be that way. So by necessity, you will always draw an ace. But this is just another way of saying that it's all ultimately chance. It's just random circumstance that all the cards were aces. Do you see how necessity ultimately will boil down to chance?
It's possible that the way reality is, things just necessarily occur.
In other words, chance. If something just happens to be a certain way, that is another way of saying that it's the product of chance. So necessity is not a third alternative. It's just another way of saying chance did it. Now let's look at what I am driving at here in relation to the cosmos and why it ultimately must either be the product of design or chance. Now real quick, if you're listening to this on your phone and it's in your pocket, I suggest taking it out to follow along for this next part, as the visuals will help. So imagine that we are in a universe. Let's call it universe 1.0. This is our universe. It allows for life. We know this. But we ask, how could such complex life come about? Well, we might say that it's because of the physical properties of our universe. So let's call those properties X. But is it mere chance that our universe has properties X? If you say that it could not be otherwise, or of necessity it had to be X, and could not be otherwise, that is to say that we just happened to have X, or in other words, that the universe is the product of chance. But what if there are multiple universes, and they all have all sorts of different properties? But again, we could simply ask, why do all of these different universes have the different properties that they do? And again, we face the same issue. They were either designed or they arose by chance. But what about evolution? Couldn't there be some cosmic process of evolution that governs the formation of these local universes? Perhaps. But that would mean the multiverse, or what I'm calling in this analogy, universe 2.0, that would have a set of properties that governed the formation of all of these local universes. But where did the properties of the multiverse, what I'm calling properties A in this slide, come from? Are these multiverse properties the product of design or chance? Do you see what's going on here? Evolution happens because of the properties of the universe, so it can't be used to explain where those properties came from. Again, please remember this critical point. Evolution happens because of the properties of the universe, so it can't be used to explain why a universe has those properties in the first place. All you do is push the question back a step. The only answer to why the universe has the properties it does is and must be either chance or design. It's inescapable. Necessity ultimately reduces to chance, and evolution either exists because of design or chance. So let's consider his first major argument debunked. But isn't this just me going into the areas of our ignorance and putting God into the gaps? That was his second main argument that he made in the debate. Let's explore it.
And so let's go through a deep dive examining the different types of theistic epistemologies, and we'll see how good they are at understanding and explaining reality. And then we can contrast that with, godless epistemologies that don't rely on supernatural explanations, and we'll see how they compare.
So he sets up the debate as this scientific epistemology versus this supernatural theistic epistemology. And right off the bat, we have a problem. He is framing this in the classic science versus religion way, and this is just a bad way of thinking. Science is a tool for understanding certain truths about the natural processes in the world, and it's brilliant at doing this. Now, religion, on the other hand, is a slippery term. I don't believe in religion. I believe in truth. The truth is my religion. In fact, I condemn religions of all kinds that teach falsehoods. My religion fully permits me to reject everything that is false and to embrace all truths, scientific or otherwise.
The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints embraces all truth that God conveys to his children, whether learned in a scientific laboratory or received by direct revelation from him.
But keep in mind, I also reject scientism, which is a belief that Seth seems to embrace. And this belief presupposes that the only things that are real are those that are accessible by the scientific method, and therefore all truth is scientific truth. There is a lot more that can be said about the poor framing of this entire issue, but we'll go on.
So the first off, if we're going to look at the history of theism, one of the most striking features is mythology. And if we're going to look at what mythology is, it seems like a theistic epistemology.
Wrong. The epistemology of my religion is far more than mere myth-making. Perhaps Seth has not seen my collective witness epistemology series. Sadly, I think Seth ends up making a straw man here.
If you look across many different religions, there's kind of a pattern that starts to emerge. And that pattern could be reduced to something like the following. I'm an ancient person, and I look out into the world, and I see a phenomenon. I'm like, how can I understand this phenomenon? And then, what do they do with mythology? They make something up. There's plenty of examples of people just making up explanations. For example, the Egyptian religion, they saw a phenomenon of rivers that were overflowing. If you're an Egyptian, you're like, I wonder why the river is overflowing. It must be because of the gods. The gods have these divine buckets of water, and they're dumping it in the river. That's how they understand reality, by making up a story. What about the Greeks? The Greeks, they saw the sun and the moon traveling through the sky. They see the phenomenon, and they're like, how do I explain this? Then they make up a story. The sun and the moon, they ride on chariots. These divine chariots are taking the sun god and the moon god across the sky. Fancy that. Their understanding of reality is based on making something up. What else? We've got stories about fire. Fire is such an interesting phenomenon. Where does it come from? They make it up. Native Americans, they see a mountain. Where does the mountain come from? There's a snake underground, and he's shaking up the earth, making the mountain. Where does lightning come from? It comes from Zeus, right?
So he is talking about a pattern here. But what he fails to realize is that the pattern he is describing is the pattern found in false ancient pagan religions. And he is actually providing good reasons to reject those pagan religions which used God of the Gap's logic. And frankly, anytime someone's using God of the Gap's logic, we should reject what they're saying. But Seth does not seem to understand that the Judeo-Christian tradition brought about something very different in its conception of God's relationship to nature.
The great founders of the modern sciences learned two basic truths, theological in nature, that made the sciences possible. Here's the first one. The world, or nature, is not God. Now, that might seem like a commonplace, but it is not. Go back now to ancient times, come up even to modern times. The tendency to divinize nature, to say that nature is divine. Think of ancient peoples worshiping the mountain or the planets or the sun and so on. Look at forms of animism. Look at even today, a sort of deification of nature. Well, see, if you deify the world, you say that nature is divine, you're not going to analyze it. You're not going to cut it up and dissect it and experiment upon it. You're going to worship it in some way. What made the emergence of the experimental sciences possible was a keen sense that nature is not divine. They would have learned that from the theological doctrine of creation. Here's the second great truth they learned also from the doctrine of creation. That nature, though it's not God, is imbued in every detail and in every nook and cranny by intelligibility. What must every scientist assume as he or she goes out to meet the world? That he or she will meet a world that is patterned, that has form, understandability. Now, this is by no means obvious. We take it so for granted. We don't even think about it, but it's by no means obvious that the universe should be marked by an ordered formality.
The very earliest records of the Judeo-Christian tradition posited a God who spoke chaos into order, and that the universe itself was ordered by law. This was in contrast to the ancient pagan religions of that day. These are the religions that Seth talks about that saw the world as an arbitrary place where fate was ruled by the whims of the gods. The ancient pagan religion's conception was of an arbitrary rather than an ordered universe. Even the Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle moved away from the pagan notions of God and towards one that were far more aligned with the Christian conception of deity. A conception which saw a unified, unmoved mover at the root of reality. This was the product of realizing that the universe is ordered. In essence, Christian theology predicted an ordered cosmos, and the modern sciences arose as people went out to seek to understand that order in nature. And the crazy thing is this: they actually found it. They made a prediction, and the prediction came true. The universe is not arbitrary. It's ordered and organized according to laws. Laws that Seth thinks arose by chance. In addition, Christianity, in seeking out God's laws in nature, funded and sponsored what was called natural theology throughout the Middle Ages, which eventually gave rise to the church-sponsored university systems, and eventually that birthed all of the modern sciences. Essentially, all of the great founders of modern science were seekers of God's order in nature, not because they expected to find God under some rock as if he was something in nature, but instead because they expected to find an ordered cosmos because their theology spoke of a God who ruled over and above the physical universe through law. But they also understood that while science provided a type of explanation about how things happened, it does not explain why they happened.
You see, why did Newton not abandon God when he found gravity? For a very simple reason. He didn't think that God is the same kind of explanation as a scientific explanation. Why is the water boiling? Well, it's boiling because the heat energy from the flame is being conducted through the base of the copper kettle, and that's stimulating the molecules of water. They're moving faster and faster. That's why it's boiling. Is it? No, it's boiling because I would like a cup of tea. Now, why are you laughing? Well, you're laughing because I'm talking nonsense. Which of the two reasons is the correct one? Both. And you need both. The scientific explanation and the personal agent explanation. Now tell me, which is the more important one? People have been making tea for millennia without knowing anything about the science of heat. It's actually the personal one. Now that's a very simple illustration. I find kids can understand it, but a lot of scientists can't. It's utterly astonishing. They say the science is the only explanation you need. That's nonsense. Now, follow this. My two explanations of the water boiling don't conflict. They don't compete. They complement. They're two different kinds of explanation, but now comes the crunch. You need both of them.
Do you see how science and religion can work together side by side? In my way of viewing the world, science is a subset of religion because it is one of the many tools that we have to discover truth. But science only explains certain kinds of truth.
When we hear somebody say science explains, you've heard people say that. And what do we think? For instance, I was taught the law of gravity at school. We might as well stick with that. We're on gravity tonight. keeps us on the ground, you know. What was I taught about the law of gravity? Do you know what I thought at school? I thought it explained gravity. It doesn't, you know. Nobody knows what gravity is, not even today. And if you don't believe me, read Richard Feynman. You see, the law of gravity is brilliant. It gives us a mathematical way of calculating the motion, say, of the planets and so on. It enables us to land a person on the moon even without Einstein's corrections. It's wonderful, but it doesn't tell us what gravity is. Newton realized that. Non fingo hypothesi, he wrote. I don't make hypotheses. I don't know what gravity is. But here's a mathematical description of how it works. I think Wittgenstein, the great philosopher, put it best when he said, the great delusion of modernism is that the laws of nature are explanations of the phenomena of nature, when they're not. They are descriptions. They're not explanations. So what's that saying? It's saying when we say the law of gravity explains, it doesn't explain everything, even at the scientific level. The nature of explanation is very different from the popular understanding of it, and this is so important. The God explanation doesn't conflict with a scientific explanation, mostly answering completely different questions, as we've seen. So the idea that science can bury God begins to look more and more foolish.
Now, not only does Seth get the framing of science and religion wrong, he also falsely assumes that I am engaging in the God of the gaps logic of the ancient pagans.
But here is what I want to tell you. This is the most important takeaway. This mythology epistemology, it fundamentally is structured like a God of the gaps argument. What is a God of the gaps argument? It's when you see something you don't understand and you say, that is because of God, right? And so the God of the gaps argument, they're constantly targeting our ignorance, right? That's what the ancients did. So the ancients, they had all of this ignorance, and they're like, all of this stuff is because of the gods.
So his basic idea is that I am going to our area of ignorance about the fine-tuning of the universe and saying, God did it. But that is not what I'm doing. I am actually doing the opposite. I am engaging with what we do know from our uniform and repeated experience about the nature of mind and its observed effects on the physical world, and then seeing if it better explains the fine-tuning of the universe when compared to an appeal to random chance. Here is the basic logic.
A God of the gaps argument is an argument that has a formal logical structure that in logic is known as an argument from ignorance. It's an informal fallacy, and arguments from ignorance have the following form. If I say cause A is not sufficient to produce effect X, and then I say, therefore, cause B must have produced X, but I have no independent evidence that cause B can produce X, then I've committed a fallacy of arguing from ignorance. Because just because A isn't sufficient to produce the effect in question doesn't mean that some other cause did it. You have to have independent evidence that that other cause is capable of doing it. And that then becomes a God of the gaps argument when you say, well, various natural processes aren't sufficient to produce, say, the origin of the first life or the origin of the first animals in the history of life. And then if I were to say, therefore God did it, that would be a God of the gaps argument. It would be an argument from ignorance. But that's not how we're arguing when we make the case for intelligent design, because we're adding an additional premise. We're saying that various kinds of natural processes are not sufficient to produce the origin of new functional information. And we're specifically dialed into the presence of the digital code that's stored in the DNA molecule that performs important biological functions. It's information in a very specific technical sense. So we say we show that various natural processes are insufficient to produce these large infusions of information we see arising in the history of life that are necessary to build new forms of life. But then we point out from observation of the world around us that we do know of a cause that does produce information. We have independent evidence that intelligent agency, that mind, that creative intelligence can generate information. You and I are doing it right now as we're talking. We're trading notes, trading information. So information is, in our experience, a mind product. We have independent experience that minds produce information. And so when we infer an intelligent agent as having acted in the past based on the presence of digital code stored in the macromolecules of life, we're not arguing from ignorance. We're arguing from our knowledge of cause and effect, and specifically what we know minds can do, namely produce information that merely undirected material processes can't.
The reality is that we don't know why the universe has the properties that allow for life to exist, but it must either be chance or the design of a mind. So we must infer which of these best explains what we observe. Minds produce information and order. And if at the root of the universe is information and order, it is perfectly logical to infer that a mind causing that information and order is more probable than the alternative explanation of information and order arising purely by chance. So no, this is not God of the gaps logic. It is an inference to the best explanation amongst the alternatives for the phenomena in question. And it is based on our uniform and repeated experience with minds and what we know that minds can produce in the physical world. So, I think we should consider his second point debunked. Now, let's move on to point 3. This is the idea that the universe made us to fit it, and not the other way around. Now, Seth alluded to this idea in our debate, but in his follow-up video with Cody from the Uber Mormon channel, Cody really dug into it.
And this is the thing about fine-tuning that always makes me so frustrated, is he's saying, he made this whole thing about how if you're in a room and it could either be 1 degree or 10 billion degrees, and it just so happens to be at 72 degrees, which is perfect for you, isn't that amazing? And I would say, yes, if the room and you exist separately, then yes, it makes perfect sense that that would be a miracle because there are so many options.
Okay, so this is a critical point to remember. Cody is admitting that if you have two independently given patterns conforming to each other, that would be powerful evidence for design and not random chance. Remember this concept of independently given patterns.
But what everybody forgets when they do this, and it drives me insane, is that room created you. The environment, the parameters of that environment created the type of life that could spring forward from that environment.
Okay, did you notice what he said? The parameters of the environment is what created you. He doesn't realize that the parameters existing in such a way to create you is the great mystery. Life does not have to exist. In fact, a universe without life is far more probable. That's the point. So there are two different independently given patterns. A pattern of parameters that allow for life to exist, and all the other possible patterns of parameters that could exist. So, what better explains the existence of the parameters of our universe that allow for life to exist out of all of the possible parameters that could have existed? Chance or design? Those are the only two options. This argument that the universe designed us is often made using the famous puddle analogy.
There's a famous analogy that author Douglas Adams used. It's like a puddle in a hole who thinks, wow, this hole perfectly fits my shape. It's like it was made for me. No, it's more like you found a way to fit into the hole. Similarly, the universe wasn't created for us. We evolved to fit the universe.
Right, but we're talking about life emerging in the first place and being able to exist at all, not just evolve.
Do you see what he means? Sure, life can adapt to an environment, but we are asking why the parameters exist in the first place that allowed for such a process of evolution to happen. There is no reason our universe had to allow for life or evolutionary processes at all. Again, you have two independent patterns. The pattern of parameters that would allow for life and all of the possible patterns those parameters could have taken.
So the better analogy would be not liquid water, but an elaborate ice sculpture falling into the ground and landing in a hole that it perfectly fits. That would make it a designed hole rather than just a random one, if it could fit something as unique as an ice sculpture.
So again, we have Seth and others trying to appeal to evolution as a third option, but it's not. So the third argument is also debunked. So now for the bonus argument. The bonus argument is actually not from Seth, but from my little brother Forrest channel, Latter-day Skeptic. Apparently he felt he needed to back up Seth, and so he put together his own rebuttal video that largely just appealed to authority without really making solid arguments against my core claims and premises in my argument. However, there was one that I think is worth addressing. It's the idea that we can't possibly know anything about what would emerge from different constants and quantities in the universe or different parameters because we only have one universe.
People say yes, but if the constants were a little bit different, there would be nothing. And that's incredible intellectual arrogance and stupidity, because nobody would be able today, from the standard model, to predict chemistry and life. Nobody at all. So how do you know what would happen if you change a value of of a constant? Imagine you change the mass of a quark, a coupling of the Higgs a little bit. Of course there would not be carbon, there would not be stars, but there would be something else. And nobody is able to say correctly and plausibly and credibly that the universe would not be complex and whatever, because we're not able to do this calculation.
Really? This is like saying we can't plausibly imagine what would happen to life on Earth if we were orbiting 1 mile away from the sun. In fact, there is all sorts of scientific literature out there that uses mathematics to predict the effects of changes in the constants and quantities of nature.
Yeah, look, I mean, there is a broad scientific literature in the professional, physics journals which claims to do exactly what Ravelli says is impossible, which claims to predict exactly what would happen if these constants had been different. The arguments that are there in the literature, which you'd think someone who is familiar with the literature might actually try and deal with, rather than just slagging them off as being impossible and arrogant, are things like, if the constants were such and such, then the most stable, lightest particle you could make out of just quarks, in our universe it's the proton, which you may be familiar with. In these other universes it would be a different kind of particle. For various reasons having to do with energy levels, that particle wouldn't be able to bind to itself or to anything else. And so the smallest piece of stuff in the universe, the only stable thing in the universe, is unable to create any structure at all, and therefore we don't think it could make life. That's the kind of argument that's out there.
What's ironic is that in the video Forrest was pulling clips from, Sean Carroll, a famous atheist physicist, contradicts the very idea that such calculations are impossible.
What Ravelli says is impossible, Sean Carroll does later in the video. Ravelli says we can't take the constants and laws of nature and say that definitely there wouldn't be life in a given universe with a given set of constants. At 2257, go look it up, Sean Carroll says
cosmological constant is probably the best candidate we have for pointing at something and saying, here, we could imagine this being very, very different. If it were very large or very large and negative, there's just not enough time. There's just not enough ways to make a planet, much less a living being. That's very, very plausible.
it's exactly what Ravelli just said was impossible. It's literally 20 minutes later in the video.
Anyway, I think we can consider Forrest's argument also debunked. So in the end, my opponent's strongest arguments are all debunked, and my arguments stand. In the end, reality must either be the product of design or chance. Seth did not produce a third alternative. Now, perhaps you think that the ordered universe that produced you, those you love, your conscious experience, beauty, morality, art, science, literature, love, knowledge, religion, etc., is all ultimately the product of random chance. But is that really the best inference? Does order and law and beauty come from chance or from a mind? Does theism or atheism better account for reality? I will leave that up to you to decide. But Alma said unto him, Thou hast had signs enough. Will ye tempt your God? Yea, and all things denote there is a God, yea, even the earth, and all things that are upon the face of it, yea, and its motion, yea, and also all the planets which move in their regular form do witness that there is a supreme Creator. The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of His hands. So do you enjoy the content here on Thoughtful Faith? If so, be sure to hit the notification bell. This ensures that our new videos show up on your feed. Also, be sure to check out our Facebook group called Thoughtful Saints, where myself and others discuss the sorts of topics found on this channel. And lastly, if you think other people would benefit from this video, please be sure to share it.